The Privacy Act is changing, so what do you need to know?
I'm Alyssa Blackburn.
I'm Mike Loader. TechEdge starts now. Hello everyone, welcome to TechEdge, presented by the team at AvePoint, where each episode we delve into the latest industry trends for business, IT and their significance in today's ever-changing landscape. Now in this episode we look into the latest updates for privacy legislation and what it means for organisations. Alyssa, what can we expect from this program today?
So Mike, did you know that the privacy legislation in Australia actually doesn't apply to a bunch of businesses? I know. The problem with that is though, that businesses and organisations are holding more and more of our data than they ever were before. And so we as citizens and consumers of their goods and services want to be assured that, they're holding on to that information in the right way. And of course, you know that we've had a number of really significant breaches of people's privacy over the last couple of years. So it's about time that the Privacy Act was revised to take some of that into account. So I'm so pleased today that we have Anne Cornish, who is the CEO at the Records and Information Management Professionals Australasia, to join us to talk about this really important topic. So, Anne, welcome to this show. Can you give us first a quick overview of some of the changes that are headed our way when we're talking about privacy legislation?
Sure. First, thanks very much for having me. I really appreciate it. Just before I answer that, I want to comment very quickly on what you said, Alyssa, about lots of businesses having our information and not necessarily being compelled to comply under the Privacy Act. And that's so true. You think about it, the newsagents down the street has a lot of our personal information, such as credit card information, your address, phone numbers, probably even when you're home and when you're not, or when you're away. So that you're spot on in that respect. But there's obviously going to be change, and that's great, and that's time. Some of the changes, some of the sort of the major changes that are coming out, and they're supposedly coming out in August, so we're looking forward to that, it's obviously got to change for the digital age. There's some major issues with the current Act at the moment that it doesn't allow for the automated decisions or automated personal information that occurs, such as if you're denied a bank loan and those sorts of things. What happens to that information because it's automated? It's processed through a computer and it said that no, you're not eligible for that loan, but that's personal information. The other thing that's going to happen, and I'm not sure how stringent they're going to be with this, but increase the penalties. That's another major change that's going to occur. So it'll be sort of higher fines, and especially on those repeated privacy breaches. Enhanced rights for individuals, which I think is really important, that have greater rights to and access to correct their information. How often do we get told that, your date of birth's on this particular day and it's not? Now, whether it's a typo or whether we've given them the wrong information, and how to change it. It's like near impossible.
I'm purposely trying to get away with 1987, but so far it hasn't been successful.
I've tried that too, Alyssa, too. Yeah, don't worry. And I'm one of those people that when it is wrong and it's in my favour, I don't want to change. So there'll be also that mandatory data breach reporting now. They've expanded that, where it wasn't always necessarily mandatory to report data breaches, and depending on the size of the organisation as well, that's going to come down. That'll be mandatory to report. I'd suggest most of them. We're yet to see the details of this. As I've mentioned, it's not released until August.
And
the big one,
sorry to jump in. I'm curious to know how this compares to privacy legislation across other countries based on all the stuff you've told us here.
Yeah, well, that's really good. It's actually coming up to par with the EU, which is the GDPR, or that acronym always gets me, and it's even coming into line with the California Consumer Privacy Act. So what that means is that what I've just mentioned about the updates is coming to fruition. That's been happening in the EU and in the US pretty much for some time now. So we're coming into line with those. But the only probably big difference is that the EU, the GDPR, actually allows for information outside of that is actually held outside of the EU,
right.
But it's used by EU businesses. So, but we haven't done that here yet. That hasn't happened.
And I think, and you made a really good point earlier about penalties, and having worked in organisations that are subject to the Privacy Act, when you actually looked at the penalties for breaches, it was a situation where it was so much cheaper to just pay the penalty than actually implement the systems and processes that you need to protect people's personal information, which is a major, major problem. So I think definitely one of the really positive things that is coming out of this review, and hopefully that we'll see when they do release the new regulations, is the increase in penalties for organisations that just don't get it together and take the management of personal information really seriously. But I think also, obviously, as we talked about at the beginning, in terms of it now being expanded to a lot more organisations in Australia, what do you think are some of the potential impacts, particularly to small business who haven't had to worry about this before?
Yeah, so small business, I think, are going to struggle with this a little bit, Alyssa. It's going to be a hard impact on resources. And, I think the biggest thing is going to be about their knowledge and their ability to implement new technologies to be able to cope with these changes. So just to clarify, though, small business at this point in time probably won't occur in this first review or this first update. They're looking at the small business recommendation is actually coming. They're going to further consultation on that. And I personally think it's probably just a hold-off transitional period, and it will eventually occur. But I think the resources, as I mentioned, the technology, the ability to implement, and as I said, just the knowledge and education. And I mentioned the newsagents, and I'm not being silly about this, but, mum and dad that own the newsagents down the road aren't as people to be implementing very stringent privacy laws. And it's not because they don't want to, it's just that they don't necessarily have the skill set or the capabilities to do so.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk a little bit about this strengthened security and, of course, data destruction obligations. How's that going to impact businesses and, of course, individuals as well, if we can touch on that briefly?
Yeah, so from a business point of view, it's as we've all mentioned, it's going to make things. Let's start again. They're going to do things. They're going to have to update. They're going to have to make sure that they're going to look at their risk management a lot different, as Alyssa said, from a penalty point of view. It was probably easier sometimes just to pay the fine, if a fine was even applied, to be honest. If they're going to be serious about this and there are fines, as I said, the risk assessment becomes a lot higher from a privacy perspective. So they'll be required to actually improve their practices greatly, in my opinion. Regular audits and ensure that they're compliant, and I'm going to plug this, and have the right people in place to manage their information correctly, because let's be honest, guys, it's the most valuable asset that any organisation has, and really, is it looked after correctly and securely?
Yeah. Please continue. No, I was just going to say, what are the potential challenges, I suppose, for small businesses when it comes to adapting to everything we're discussing today on the show?
Yeah, as I sort of mentioned earlier, it's about, as I mentioned, the resource constraints, the ability, the skills, and the awareness, I suppose. That's my biggest concern is you can put as much education out there, but I really, as I said, as a small business under $3 million turnover, is it really going to be something that is at the forefront of their mind? I mean, let's be honest, cost of living at the moment, just running a business at the moment that only turns over under that is a struggle for day to day, let alone putting this additional. I'm not saying it shouldn't be done, I'm just saying I think that it's a big ask.
Yeah. It is a big ask, definitely. But when exactly as you said at the beginning, when you think about the vast amount of personal information that organisations more and more and more are holding about us, it's an essential ask. So I don't necessarily, want my newsagent to be hacked, but I certainly don't want my information out on the web for anybody to be able to access. But just in case they are, I absolutely was born in 1987. But Anne, what, in your opinion, where do we start? So we're looking at all of these changes. You've detailed some of those for us. What should organisations be starting with now, before these changes even get here, to make sure they're set up in the best possible way?
Yeah, and this applies to big organisations or small organisations. So I think the first thing that everyone needs to do is understand what they're collecting. What personal information do we have? I think we're very naive to think, and I'm talking from a business perspective, anyone in business, that if they really genuinely believe they know that what they're collecting genuinely and what they're collecting it for. A lot of the time we collect things just because that's the way we've always done it. and that needs to change. So I think that's really important. We need to audit that. I think we need to do a bit of analysis on what the current practices are and what the new practices should be, and understand the differences. And when you're in a small business, this shouldn't take very long in comparison to a bigger organisation. Update your policies. In a small news agency, Alyssa and Mike, they're not going to have a policy.
Yeah.
But it could be advantageous for them to have a stock standard templated policy in place, because if someone does try to, if there is penalties enforced or on them, or someone tries to take them for some sort of personal divulgement, that then we've got the issue is they've got a policy. At least they can say they're practicing or they're looking at doing the right thing. I think, as we mentioned, staff training and education is so important. The big one that's going to be the killer is the technical enhancements, the technology that's required possibly to reduce the risk in any organisation could be a problem. So they're the things that I think that people need to start looking at: technology, their processes, and auditing what they're collecting the information for.
Absolutely. So when it comes to either finding or storing this information we're talking about, what's the one thing business leaders should perhaps focus on?
Well, from a records and information management point of view, the best thing they can do is minimise what they have. There is retention and disposal across the board for every business, allows you to destroy records legally, and that's not what we're doing. So data minimisation is really important. Get rid of what you don't need, guys, or don't collect what you don't need. I think that's what the important message that we can put across, because it lessens your risk overall. So if something's disposal, get rid of it. Like legally, I'm not saying just throw things out, but if the law or legislation says you can, why not get rid of it? And I think you mentioned it earlier, Alyssa, about that there's been some big hacks over the last couple of years. And can I say to you, those hacks have been enhanced or increased and been an impact on society or the community because of the keeping a lot of information for a lot longer than they needed to.
Very well said by you, Anne. Thank you so much for joining us here on the program, and hopefully we get to speak again down the track as this continues to evolve, as we know it does.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Pleasure. Thanks very much.
Anne's definitely given us some great advice there. These changes are significant, but they're absolutely essential at the same time. And I think it's great that governments in general are recognising that and making it a priority. But you do have to weigh that up with, what is the impact of business on this? But important changes and important things for organisations to start to focus on.
That we will no doubt be keeping a close eye on.
Absolutely.
And of course, this is Ticker. We will be right back in just a moment.
You're watching Ticker. We'll have more in just a few minutes.